Okay, hello, sixth period. We are going to finish up talking about the Watergate break-in before we move on to talking about Ford and Carter. So this is where we left off yesterday, was with the bungled burglary. We talked about that the committee to re-elect the president had led a break-in at the Democratic National Convention headquarters, but that they had been caught, and it appeared that they were going to try to take pictures of documents and bug the telephones of the DNC so that they could spy on them. We talked about that the Nixon administration covered it up illegally. They paid out the people that had been involved to try to buy their silence. They used different government administrations like the CIA and the FBI to cover it up. And for the most part, that cover up worked. And it wasn't really an issue in the 1972 election because most people just sort of forgot about it. Because they were able to cover it up. And so Nixon was reelected in 1972. But in January of 1973, the cover-up began to unravel. So one of the men that had been involved in the burglary sent a letter to the presiding judge over their trial that indicated that he had lied under oath about the Watergate burglary and hinted that powerful members of the Nixon administration had been involved in the break-in. So this got the public kind of interested once again in the Watergate situation, and President Nixon tried to basically get everybody to forget about it. He also appointed a special appointed a special prosecutor to investigate the Watergate situation. But the president's assurances came too late because in May of '73, the Senate began its own investigation of Watergate. So in the Senate's investigation, there came some startling revelations. One of them came from John Dean, a former counselor to the president. He said that President Nixon had been deeply involved in the cover-up, that there had been meetings where they all discussed how to cover up the bungled burglary. The White House strongly denied the charges, and it kind of reached an impasse for a little bit because they couldn't figure out who was telling the truth. But then former presidential aide Alexander Butterfield stunned the committee when he revealed that Nixon had taped virtually all of his presidential conversations. Basically, Nixon had bugged himself. Nixon had everything that he said taped, just like he had things that other people were saying taped. And so Butterfield tells them that Nixon had taped conversations that would prove that he knew about the Watergate break-in and knew about the Watergate cover-up. So there follows a year-long court battle for the Nixon tapes after this revelation. Archibald Cox, he was the special prosecutor that the Attorney General had appointed to investigate the case, and he actually took the president to court in October of '73 to obtain the tapes. In what became known as the Saturday Night Massacre, Nixon refused and ordered Attorney General Richardson to fire the special prosecutor, but the special prosecutor refused and resigned. The Deputy Attorney General also refused the order, and he was fired too, and that became known as the Saturday Night Massacre. Several months after the Saturday Night Massacre, the House Judiciary Committee began examining the possibility of an impeachment hearing. So there's a big White House shakeup that also results in the Vice President Spiro T. Agnew resigning. It was revealed that he had accepted bribes from engineering firms while he was the governor of Maryland. Acting under the 25th Amendment, President Nixon nominated the House Minority Leader Gerald Ford as his new vice president, and Congress confirmed the nomination. So that's where we stand at this point, that Ford is now the vice president. So now we need to look at the fall of the president. So in March of '74, a grand jury indicted 7 presidential aides on charges of conspiracy, obstruction of justice, and perjury, which is lying under oath. And the investigation was beginning to close in on Nixon, the president. So in the spring of '74, Nixon told a television audience that he was releasing over 1,000 pages of edited transcripts of his White House conversations about Watergate. Nixon's offering failed to satisfy investigators who demanded the unedited tapes. Nixon refused, and the case went to the Supreme Court. On July 24th, 74, the Supreme Court ruled unanimously that the president must surrender the unedited tapes. The court rejected Nixon's argument that doing so would violate national security. Evidence involving possible criminal activity could not be withheld, even by a president. President Nixon still maintained that he had done nothing wrong, and in a press conference in November of 73, he proclaimed defiantly his very famous quote, "I am not a crook." Okay, well, he was a crook. So even without holding the original tapes, the House Judiciary Committee determined that there was enough evidence to impeach Richard Nixon, so they determined that he was in fact a crook. On July 27th, the committee approved 3 articles of impeachment. They charged the president with obstruction of justice, abuse of power, and contempt of Congress for refusing to obey a congressional subpoena to release the tapes. On August 5th, Nixon finally did release the tapes. They contained a lot of gaps, and one tape had a very disturbing 18.5-minute gap. According to the White House, the president's secretary had accidentally erased part of a conversation, and that was what accounted for the 18.5-minute gap. Yeah, sure. So more importantly, there was a tape dated June 23rd, 1972, just 6 days after the break-in, that contained a conversation between Nixon and one of his advisors that disclosed the evidence investigators needed. Not only had the president known about the role of members of his administration in the burglary, he had agreed to the plan to obstruct the FBI's investigation. So the evidence now seemed overwhelming. On August 8th, 1974, before the full House could vote on the articles of impeachment, President Nixon announced his resignation from office. Defiant as always, he admitted no guilt. He merely said that some of his judgments, quote, were wrong. The next day, Nixon and his wife, Pat, returned home to California, and a short time later, Gerald Ford was sworn in as the 38th President of the United States. So let's look at the effects of Watergate. They have endured long after Nixon's resignation. Eventually, 25 members of the Nixon administration were convicted and served prison terms for crimes connected to Watergate. Along with the divisive war in Vietnam, Watergate produced a deep disillusionment with the so-called imperial presidency, and in the years following Vietnam and Watergate, the American public and the media developed just a general cynicism about public officials that still exists today. Watergate remains the scandal and investigative story against which all others are measured. Okay, so that catches you up with the rest of the class. And you are now going to move on to talking about the fallout of Watergate, which is the Ford presidency.